that in terms of the phase 2 processes. So the fast track approvals bill is done, that freshwater management, that is now an act. We're waiting on the select committee for the resource management consenting other systems. So as Andy just said, it talks about making the MDRS optional. It also makes some changes to the way we consider consenting, natural hazards, emergency management. And also there has been, as part of phase 2, a very significant review of our national direction. When I talk about national direction, that's national policy statements and national environmental standards. So national policy statements are what council must give effect to when we're plan making, and national environmental standards are where there is a rule set at a central government level. So the cell phone tower issue that was recently discussed, that is a national environmental standard. It is set by central government. It is not set at local government level. With the announcements of phase 3, there has been quite a significant pullback from central government on exactly what they'll look at through phase 2. They were looking at 21 different pieces of national policy statements and national environmental standards, and they have looked to pull that back. And we've been given advice that that consultation will happen in the coming months on those documents. So on the next slide, you'll see a table. And this table gives you, this is the direction that we've been given from central government. Sorry, just to the next slide. So this table is what central government have advised that they will look at through phase 2. So that's that consultation. So that's that consultation that we have been advised will be end of May, June. So I've looked at the new one. So they're looking at still releasing a new national policy statement on infrastructure and national environmental standards on granny flats and Papakāinga. So that is setting rules for granny flats and Papakāinga, which will basically override what we currently have within our district plan. Yes.
Quick question on the cell towers, which you said we can't currently do anything about. We won't be able to with this either. That's not a.
If you look at the amend below, there's the telecommunications. So they have advised they are making changes to that NES.
Okay.
We don't know exactly what those changes are because we haven't seen it. However, that could be an opportunity where council might want to make a submission on that national environmental standard.
Right, thank you.
I think just more broadly answering that question on all of those national environmental standards, those standards are set at a national level, and if our plan is inconsistent with it, we have to align our plan with that, even though we may or may not just agree with that.
I think that's what's happening before this change. We had to do whatever the national standards required for us to do in the cell towers. Yeah,
that's correct.
Rebecca, would the general theme be to make these more enabling of development?
Yeah, that's correct. So the direction from the central government is to make it more enabling in terms of consenting, especially around infrastructure. So an example for the highly productive land, the national policy statement, at the moment there's a requirement to identify land use classification 1, 2 and 3, which is the really highly productive land. The direction has been that they're looking at getting rid of the land classification for 3. So it's really cutting down the areas that they're looking at protecting through that highly productive land. That's just an example. But it's really yet to see exactly what central government are proposing until end of May, but it is to make it more enabling, correct? Yeah. So just moving on to the next slide, you'll notice that national policy statement for urban development was not in the table. It gets its own slide. The direction from central government is that they are looking to consult with community and engage on the national policy statement for urban development through phase 2, but it won't be implemented until phase 3. This is something that we need to consider. So as we have reported to you in previous meetings and even today, the changes that have been signalled through that NPSUD are quite significant for our council. I have put up there what some of the what they have indicated in terms of the changes. So the first one is they're looking at amending how we assess development capacity. So at the moment we go through a process of understanding how much zoned land we have for development, but what is actually likely to occur. And so that's how, that's a requirement under the NPSUD, but they're looking at changing that. So for example, how we calculate feasibility. So that could mean our numbers change through that assessment.
Yeah, from what we know today, they're wanting councils to provide more development capacity and earlier. So if anything, the challenges we've got at the moment around providing sufficient development capacity are likely to get greater.
And that works in hand with the 30 years of zoned land. So it's providing more and providing it quicker. So that's something that we will need to consider as a council. And the third one is they have signalled some amendments to the intensification requirements. So at the moment, there's quite a clear policy in the NPSUD around what, how and where we are to require and provide for intensification. And they're looking at making some changes there as well. So this will be an important document for our council to consider and provide feedback on, because it does have quite significant implications for the growth of the city over that short, medium and long term.
Growth?
So my interpretation of where the central government is going is that they are looking at it's up to the council to decide in terms of where and how you grow. They're putting that end goal or that end requirement on that you've got to provide for that 30 years of zoned land. So and leaving it up to the council to decide how will you achieve that. So for our council in the past, we have taken we must grow up and we must grow out. We need both to be able to meet our development capacity requirements.
So, but if you look at what they're proposing, and generally, obviously the changes around, for example, the highly productive land is to enable more land to be used for greenfield development by removing the protection for LUC3 land. And they're also pretty keen on being more flexible, that developers are able to build in greenfield areas, even where it's not planned, if they meet their own infrastructure costs. And that's possibly easier said than done. But yeah, they do have a focus very much on greenfield development, but also intensification, particularly around transit routes, which we understand they're more keen on, and look to strengthen the provisions around intensification down transit routes, so key bus corridors and that sort of thing. But yeah, a little bit of a mixed messages being, I guess, with being more optional around the MDRS and enabling potentially councils to opt out of that if they can deliver on their development capacity requirements in a different way. Yeah.
Like, I realise this is all market driven to where we put houses, but I'm quite keen for us to have all three options available: apartment living in city centres, infill housing, intensification of housing, and greenfield housing. I'm assuming we get to make that determination of what sort of percentage that we're trying to encourage the market to do, because I wouldn't want us to overdo the greenfield when all of a sudden our community starts moving to more intensification or apartment living.
Yeah, I think with the intensification, as long as you can show that you can, I mean, it's already zoned, right? As long as you can show you can service it and it's feasible for the private sector to deliver, then you can rely on it. But where you've run into challenges with infrastructural feasibility, that's where the government's looking to us to provide the other development options. Certainly with apartment building, that's where we've struggled to date around the feasibility side of things. So, you know, and we've had that previous session through this committee around feasibility. Yeah.
Touched on the issue of like transit, and so a lot of Minister Bishop's comments publicly seem to be geared around what would work really well for Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and fits those councils having strong, you know, groups of people who are advocating to protect certain areas. So councils want the ability to influence the outcomes, and the government has money either currently or in future investing into transit orientated, or transit itself, but also transit orientated development. But we seem to be in a very, very different position. I'm just wondering if you can sort of unpack it one more layer, because looking at it, I'm trying to get an understanding of, is it realistic that we could, we've got the numbers for the, was it RER, realisable, I've forgotten the acronym now, but we've got those numbers. We know that developers say apartments are not looking great financially in general. We know we've got lots of stuff happening on a small scale around the suburbs with 2 to 3 stories, townhouses, etc. But if, and it's a big if we had a mindset that was saying we want to actually limit the amount of land that goes into greenfield for various reasons, and it might be for just cost reasons, how realistic is it under the current proposals and your understanding of the current, you know, likely funding scenarios? Because it just seems to me we can talk in theory as long as we want, but in practice, is there any way that we could get transit orientated, you know, higher density development supported by the government?
I think you've got two issues there. One is the investment in the transit corridors, and we know that's not aligning strongly at the moment with the government's transport policies, and that's why Cameron Road Stage 2 is facing its challenges. So I guess there's a bit of a chicken and an egg type thing going. If we had a nice transit corridor there, people could see it, experience it. Would that promote more development? It probably would to some extent. So there is that challenge there around the two policies not fully aligning at a government level. In terms of, if you were to limit greenfield development, I'm sure there would be some response around intensification. But what you really need for the apartment living to take off is, unfortunately, you need higher house prices. You need people be willing to pay more for those apartments. But if you were in a constrained environment, prices are likely to rise. So it's very dynamic. So you might find some of that does start to happen, particularly once we move out of this phase of the property market into, higher levels of development. Can't fully answer your question because you need a crystal ball, but I think what we would do is we would struggle to meet what the government is seeking us to do if we were to rely less on greenfield development. Yeah, particularly because of the feasibility component that goes into the assessment and the high levels of growth that we will be required to utilise. So we're going to be required, it seems, to use the Stats New Zealand high population projections for the next 30 years. And the government wants us to also look beyond 30 years out to 50 years of growth. So, yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is that there's a difference between zoning and providing and planning for growth and funding the infrastructure so if you turned off the planning, zoning and getting growth areas ready, you'd probably come under significant criticism. The second stage of then having done that, putting the infrastructure in place that enables that, if you've got other fiscal constraints that makes that not possible, I think that's a separate discussion. And we have had previous legal advice that those are decisions that need to be made under the Local Government Act and give effect to your planning under the Resource Management Act, but they're not required under the Resource Management Act, if that makes sense.
Just a little bit off topic, but still very well the government requires that and is increasing the requirements. We don't even know what schools are going to be in our district in 5 years, let alone 30 years. So why is it so unbalanced with we're required to do this for housing, but government's not required to do this for health or education?
There is not an equivalent currently in terms of the long-term plans that councils need to do or the 30-year infrastructure strategies. So government is starting to move a little bit that way. And that's where the infrastructure commissions and the IPP, so government departments, are also putting their programs of work into the infrastructure program. We were talking about earlier in the previous session. So they're improving their discipline about infrastructure planning, but it's not as comprehensive as local government, and it's just the reality of what we work in. We do have people like Ministry of Education and Te Whare Ora as and connected into the smart growth structures, and so they do know where the growth planning is, and they share with us their planning, but they've got similar issues in terms of funding infrastructure.
Are there any other questions on phase 2 before we move on to phase 3? So next slide is phase 3, which I think Christine will start with, or is it a?
I'll talk about phase 3. So you've all sent a link to a smart growth presentation. So if you've had a chance to do that, so this summarises some of that. It doesn't go into all the detail. So the Cabinet decision was made in mid-2024, and Cabinet set up a series of design principles that were signed off, and that formed the parameters for the expert advisory group, which was set up. I was asked to be a member on that expert advisory group. There were 7 people there. They were appointed as individuals, not as representatives of their organisations. And we had a 12-week period to basically come up with a blueprint for the structure of the RMA, which is a bit of an ask, but we did it. And then that went to Cabinet in March of this year, and Cabinet made a series of decisions. Those decisions are reflected in your agenda for the City Futures Committee, where you can see each recommendation that was made and whether colour-coded green, orange or red as to whether the government accepted it in full, accepted it but wanted to do further work, or didn't accept it. And there was only one matter that they didn't accept. So that's now moved on and is now moving into the next phase of implementation. So in terms of the structure of the replacement RMA, the next slide, I don't know who's controlling this beast. Is it you, Janine? Next slide. It's easy to think of it in 3 parts: the bits that are controlled by central government or the responsibility of central government, some for local government, and then the bottom again is central government. So the parameters that the Cabinet set down was to have 2 acts, a Planning Act and Environment Act. And what's proposed is, rather than, and Janine was talking about the national policy statements that are currently in play, and there's over 30 of them, isn't there? Maybe there's been 50 of them. 21. So rather than that, what the new framework will have is one national policy direction under the Planning Act and one national policy direction under the National Environment Act. There will be nationally standardised zones and national standards and regulations, and then in the Environment Act, similarly, national environmental limits. So the idea is that at a national level, a lot of the standardisation will occur, and then it's a bit like a pick and mix menu. You pick and mix from that, but a lot of the work is done at that national level. From there, local government will be required to do 1 plan per region, and it's got a couple of components. It has a regional spatial plan. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a slide later. And then the regional plan will have Planning Act chapters and National Environment Plan chapters. Some of them will relate to the whole of the region, and some of them will relate to subparts or individual territorial authorities area within that region. So that's where you take those national standards and you apply them at a local level. And then when it comes down to enforcement and compliance, that's proposed that would be managed at a central government level, and there's a new planning tribunal, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute as to what that looks like. So if we flick to the next slide. So here's just a little bit of a drill down on that national planning, that national role. In terms of the Planning Act, it's proposed that that policy direction would be pretty succinct, and at the moment there's no hierarchy or clarity on how you manage conflicts or the differences between individual policy statements, which is one of our biggest problems. So on the one hand, you've got to protect the environment and everything in it, but you've also got to enable housing, and that you can't actually do everything. And so, but there's no guidance as to how you reconcile and manage that. And so this new framework would require that to be addressed at both the Environmental Act and the Planning Act. And then there would be default zones and standardised provisions that would apply. There is an alternative pathway if you want to do something outside of that, but it is what we described in the panel as stickier. So it's going to take you longer. It's got more consultation, and you're going to have to justify why you can't work or why you've chosen not to apply the standardised zones. So there is a pathway, but you've just got to go through it. Whereas if you pick the default zones up and the default plan provisions, they're basically then applied straight through, and there's a really quick pathway through as compared to the alternative route.
Can you explain what nationally standardised zones are?
So there would be standardised zones for residential high density, for rural, commercial, industrial, those sorts of things. And it'd be within that, there'd be different groupings. But so the idea is, really the thinking was, why do you need a plethora of noise standards across New Zealand? They should all be the same if you're in a rural zone and in a urban zone. So every council is going through the process of getting noise experts, creating zones or standards, and then applying those. And they're different in different places, and only marginally, but there's no standardisation. Similarly, distances from boundaries, daylighting, all those sorts of things. It's like they don't need to all be different. There'll be a standardised standard that comes through, and if you apply that, it's like a clear runway to proceed. Yeah.
And it's the local that will determine where those zones are?
Yes, so what this is the rules, and then you would locally, you'd apply, you determine what applies appropriately in which parts of your city and why. So it's effectively like you've got a bit of a paint by numbers in effect, and you're choosing the numbers that apply, but you can't change those. But if you want to do something else, if you want to create your own colour, you can do so, but you have to justify why, and there's a lot more process around it, but it is possible. So. It's really trying to get greater consistency and streamlining and taking lots of the cost and time out of the process and adding more certainty into the process. And then similarly on the environment, there would be greater standardisation of a lot of the national standards. And then again, councils will determine where they would appropriately apply. Because again, every regional council is setting standards that relate to the environment. They could easily be done at a national level. Right. And then in terms of the regional spatial plans, so they effectively do what Smart Growth does. So they identify strategic direction for growth and development. A key difference is they will have statutory weights. At the moment, growth management plans and strategic spatial plans don't have any statutory weight. This would give it weight. So that means that things that are in there as you go through the planning process would be considered as having statutory weight and therefore relevant. It has to be done jointly, and within the legislation, there'll be a series of factors or matters that must be in every spatial plan and some that are optional. So that just means that places like, say, Taranaki or King Country, some of these requirements wouldn't be sensible for them to do, and it would just be cost for no benefit. So it's really trying to make sure that it's a horses for courses, really. Given our issues, we're likely to have most things apply to us. But again, it was just trying to get some cost efficiencies through the country. Your spatial plan is a place where you can, at a bespoke, your geographic area, talk about how matters in the Planning Act and the Environment Act might work together, but also where you might foresee conflicts between those acts at an applied level in your jurisdiction area. The regional spatial plan can speak to those matters, and because they would have statutory weight, then they would be relevant for consideration of any consents that would flow. And then sitting underneath the regional spatial plan would be a combined plan. In the report, we talked about the need to align spatial plans and land long-term plans and regional land transport plans, and that's something that Cabinet accepted it, but wanted to do some further work as to exactly what the statutory requirements that would be created around that. So there's a few of these things where they said, actually, we just need to drill a bit more and figure out exactly how we're going to frame that. So approved in principle, but further work. Next slide. the way the report is framed is that there is flexibility, so we could choose to do it at a sub-regional level, and then basically join sub-regions together to get to your regional level. So we think that from a Tauranga and Western Bay of Plenty sub-regional perspective, we could probably build on a lot of the smart growth stuff and add. It's definitely not a reinvention of the wheel. There might be some mandatory requirements that currently the smart growth strategy doesn't deal with, but we will be a long way through ahead in terms of having the requirements of what a spatial plan might look like, which is great. Gone the wrong way, gone backwards. One more. So, oh, that one there. So the green and blue one. You're going the wrong way. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Stop. So that one. So under the regional spatial plan is the combined district plan. And so that's where, so each territorial authority would prepare a chapter that relates to their area. So we would be responsible for doing the plans for Tauranga. If you imagine it like a book with a whole series of chapters, basically what we're doing is pulling this whole book together. So there's a chapter that talks about regional spatial plan, then there'll be a chapter about rules and matters that apply across the region, and then each council would do its own rules that relate to its own area, choosing from the colour palette, if you like, of the national standards, and then you effectively put an electronic staple through the whole lot, and that is your whole e-plan. There would be an e-plan portal for New Zealand, so you just go in and you click on your geographic area and you'll be able to drill in and see it, and all those standardised zones would come through and just be populated into each of the areas. So, and we've talked about the bespoke zones, and similarly the regional council would set in some of their environmental limits. They'd do the national environment plan for the area, and they would deal with things like significant natural areas and outstanding natural features would be something that we would work together with the regional council on, so that it would look seamless from a user's point of view, that it's a whole package regardless of which council has basically put this together. And I think if you think about this relative to the conversation that we had in the City Futures meeting around the changes to local government, the reform in general and what that might mean for local government, you can start to see here how that starts to come at an applied level, that it all just comes together in one place from a user perspective. Glenn.
I'll pick up that. So the big thing that's been talked about sort of offline, outside of this council, is the regional council's role in the future. And I'm aware under the previous government, there was a lot of talk about regionalisation, which was different to regional council roles, just regional government, central government's regional roles, if you call it that. And then under this government, it seems to be more of the same. But can you tease out, like, what are we actually talking about here? Will the regional council play the critical role for the regional plan, or just for the natural environment plan? And notwithstanding that, given your previous comment, can you expand upon that as much as you can at the moment in terms of the possibilities for the roles of each government agency?
So the blueprint identifies the things that are territorial authorities' responsibilities, which are on all of these slides, and which things sits with the regional councils. You'll see them, there's a few there. And the blueprint is predominantly focused on the what, not necessarily the who. And in I think probably the point I would make is in the cabinet decisions was a requirement for the Minister of Local Government and the Minister of RMA to report back by end of June 2025 to Cabinet on the implications of RMA reform on local government reform. So I think that's still a conversation to be had about what does all of this potentially mean for local government, given it's quite a different structure and arrangement in terms of responsibilities, but also in terms of quantity of work and what needs to be done post the full implementation of the RMA, because it'll be quite different from the workload that currently and responsibilities that currently sit with the respective councils, be significantly reduced after the transition stage. Yeah. So next slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
And just on the standardisation and looking at the direction from the principal central government direction, whatever you call the document. So there's quite a number of things that are standardised. So what are the key ones that each territorial authority in its chapter would concentrate on? Is there some key things there that remain our decision rather?
A bit of a go, and then Janine's. So Janine's sitting on one of the, she's done a lot of this in Australia where it's a similar model, but also involved in some early discussions. So it's predominantly about geographically what rules apply where. So if you think of, and when, you went here for Plan Change 33, but when we did Plan Change 33 and intensification, we looked across the city and then we said, well, Te Papa Peninsula, we want it higher along Cameron Road, and then we want it going down. We want this sort of activity in the city centre. So all of those rules around height, etc., were, and what we wanted those areas to look like, were decisions that were made by the council. So it would be a similar process in that you'd go, well, this is sort of strategically what we want to achieve, and then you go to the standardised zones and go, which one of these standardised zones would most appropriately fit, given that's what we want to achieve in this particular area. But Janine, that's one example.
And I think also for example, those national policy statements for Indigenous biodiversity is a really good example where the national direction's being given, but left for every council to write the policy framework. So the objectives, policies, rules, matters of discretion ourselves, where how this is proposed is that will all be written at central government level. And then you will just identify your significant natural areas. So your areas of significant Indigenous biodiversity across the city, you will identify them and map them. And then you rely on the rule framework that's already been written. So I think there were some really interesting statistics from Minister Bishop in terms of over 1,000 zones across the country, with very small variation between them. So how this will work is exactly, it's like a toolbox where we will pick up the appropriate zone and place it in the right location across the city. And then we will have consistent noise provisions, signage provisions, those citywide earthworks provisions. They will be set across the country, and there'll only be a certain circumstance where you might want to have specific provisions. So an example for where we might is Tauriko Business Estate has some very clear staging and sequencing for infrastructure, and that's based on population. So as the population grows, you can only go over another dwelling if you have all this infrastructure in place. That would be a really good example where we might want to apply a stickier situation that is very specific to a location in the city.
I guess who would make those decisions?
Then in terms of spatially where the zones go, like a normal plan change process, it will be pretty much the same, and hopefully not as many information requirements as we currently do. We're at the moment, our section 32 to justify our changes are talking thousands of pages. And then there's a separate process to apply or to justify where you're going to put special, or you're seeking to put bespoke provisions in a certain location, but it will generally follow that same process. Going through, what I mean by that is in going out to the community, making submissions, going through an independent hearings panel to make recommendations on what's proposed.
Criteria there to limit the scope of divergence away from the national standard.
We expect there will be, and also and what we talked about in terms of limitations of what you can appeal, which will again limit the litigiousness of what we currently work through.
Would it still have the public or targeted consultation process?
The indications are that there'll still be a public submission process for people to make a submission, correct?
Just keep our questions quick because technically our time is up, so we don't want to pinch too much time out of the next session.
Oh, I'll rock on. That's right. So there's roles that we, then next slide. So in terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, probably on this matter, the Cabinet didn't make or ruled out some elements, and that upholding treaty sentiments was a principle of the reform, but this is one of the ones where they're going to do some further work and further subsequent decisions before making some decisions on the specific wording. So it was certainly a matter that was addressed in further discussion at the government level on that one. Yep, we'll rattle through these next ones. So climate enforcement, so this is proposed to be done at a national level. So rather than every council having compliance and enforcement officers and investigation officers and taking action, there would be a national enforcement entity. So those roles that sit with council currently would move. And it would be funded a mixture of local and central government and from compliance and monitoring. So because there's so much more bespoke standardisation and less consents need to be applied for, the enforcement and compliance and monitoring part of the system is enhanced, and the nationalisation of that is one of the elements of it. There is going to be a planning tribunal, and the idea of that is a much faster, quicker, simpler place to go to rather than having to go to the Environment Court. So you can go there if you're not happy with your resource consent conditions, or council requests further information and you think it's unreasonable. So some of those things that currently create frustrations at the planning tribunal, you can just take it to get a decision and move on. Environment Court would be retained, but really for the more substantive, larger issues, and that should reduce the wait times quite significantly because things take a long time to get to the Environment Court, and it puts people off. So a much more flexible and responsive and a simpler planning tribunal process.
Is it likely with all these changes that if you've been denied permission to do something, that you'd be able to resubmit to this new regime and get a different answer, maybe?
There's no reason why you can't put a new application in, and you could actually see that maybe people who've got current consents with existing conditions may see a easier pathway and might put in a new application under the new legislation when it comes in force. We've talked about this provision that there's a requirement by July to I said June before, so it's July, for a report back to Cabinet on the implications for local government reform. The timeline is a bill to the Select Committee by the end of this calendar year, so obviously a lot of work quite quickly. There's been quite a lot, and including the media, around bipartisan, and Minister Bishop has written to the opposition parties to seek comments, and Hipkins has noted that there's a lot of common ground, and a lot of the enforcement and other provisions that are in the blueprint actually pick up from the previous RMA work that Labor had done. So there'll be a lot of things in there that they are comfortable with. And a lot of the stuff in the framework, it's the policies that get developed and the standardised zones that gets developed, which is probably where there is more political rather than the structure of the framework of the legislation and the new process overall. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that space. I think there's one more slide. So I think probably the key message to take away is this is not a minor policy tweak. It's a game changer. There are some comments that have been in the media, and the New Zealand Initiative put out some statements as well around this. Common sense replaces complexity. Rather than controlling everything, the new system would be made more enabling, and really only where there's a true effect in material ways in terms of the environment or the neighbours that the legislation will effectively step in. This national consistency, local authorities can focus really locally on the genuine local issues rather than spending an inordinate amount of time and money on technical matters, which then turn into rules rather than what's happening at their local area, and to stop that reinventing the wheel over and over again is the substantive concept that sits behind it. It's the last slide from memory. One more. Oh, yes. So in terms of us, what does it mean for us? Yeah, that's right. So what we're doing now currently, the team is looking at all of the plan change projects that we've currently got underway and thinking about that in the context of this reform and saying, well, what would be the implications? Should we continue? Should we continue in part, or should we pause? We don't want to be spending ratepayer time and money on something that would be potentially redundant. But there are certain things that we can productively continue with, particularly things that relate to how would we apply thinking at a local level, so that we can carry on with that, because we know that would be useful. So we're going to come back to a future committee, and talk about that assessment that we've done and seek your decision as to whether you support that or you support that in part. We are starting to think about what does our resourcing look like to participate in that regional spatial plan and the combined district plans, and making sure that we're positioned, and through the reset that's been reflected in in what we're moving forward with. And we do see that once the new system is in place, there will be significantly less resource consents, there's significantly less plan changes, or the scale of those plan changes will be significantly less than what has happened, what's currently happened and has happened in the past. So it has quite far-reaching implications.
Yes, Councillor Crowther.
Yeah, question, just harking back a few slides. So transport, Te Uru Kahika government, others have been talking about transport reforms meshing in with this. You know, what are the options on the table that are being talked about? And what do you see right now as the possible implications?
What respect? That's a bit of a boost.
The potential for regionalisation of decision making in the same way, you know, reforms along the lines of waters that's been explicitly talked about by LGNZ and various members of the government, and Te Uru Kahika, I understand, has had conversations around it. So the roles within public transport and other transport planning, how it fits in with the RMA reforms, all that sort of stuff.
A better conversation for this afternoon's workshop, which is more around reform implications overall, but in an RMA context, I'm not aware of anything happening in that space from that perspective.
Christine, so in terms of both plan changes and resource consent applications, you know, good understanding, ballpark, are we talking about twice the speed of getting consent, or significant? What do you
there would, in terms of consenting, there will be less consent applications because more will be enabled and set in all the standardised material. So it will be you won't even have to come for a consent. And in terms of plan changes, if you stick with the standardised zones, it will be way, way faster. So something like the Plan Change 27, which we've just done on flooding, that would probably be predominantly a standardised approach, and you wouldn't be through the process, and you wouldn't be going to the Environment Court like we've done, which has taken 5 years. Just looking at Janine, I think there was a 5-year process. It would be way, way faster. So yes. Yep. And the parameters that we were given was to increase efficiency, reduce costs for New Zealand as a nation, and get development happening in a way that still protects the environment and is appropriate. And so it's not just letting everything go, but to create more certainty and consistency. And there was some cost estimates done that would be about a 47% saving in terms of process compared to the current regime. So it's really substantive. Yeah.
Would that require then changes to the impact on the environment?
So the Environment Act and the standardised environmental standards would deal with all the environmental matters, and it was set effectively a bottom line about looking after the environment. So it's not like just the development can go, but that there's far more clarity around what those requirements are. And again, the consistency. So not every regional council is creating new standards. They're considering where those standards apply and what's relevant in particular water courses for particular reasons, and they can take that into account.
Right, thank you very much, staff. Lovely presentation, very informative, and we're only at the beginning of this. So that is the end of the City Futures